Welcome back. At this point, we have seen the use of simple linear constraints, geometrically lines, algebraically linear constraints, to analyze vanishing points, vanishing lines, reflections, shadows, and lens flare. Surprisingly simple and yet versatile analysis. And as promised, I wanted to just take a little bit of a step aside and talk a little bit about human abilities and limits. Because when you look at all of those images that we've seen, you may have this impression as, sure, this would have been relatively obvious to me. And it's always good to make sure that you understand what are you going to be effective at analyzing and what are you going to be ineffective at analyzing, and similar for your adversary who is creating the fakes. Part of what we studied in my lab over the years has been exactly this, which is simply showing people images that have been manipulated and not, and asking if they can tell the difference, and then trying to understand exactly what is happening here. So I'm going to talk about a set of 3 experiments centered around shadows, reflections, and planar perspective. And then I'm going to give you one case study. Not surprisingly, it's going to be about the Lee Harvey Oswald photo, which in my mind is one of the great examples of the failure to understand the limitations of the human visual system, not to mention some slightly crazy conspiracies. Okay, so let's start with shadows. Here's the basic experiment. We have a 3D rendered scene, as you can see here. You can see it's sort of a room. It's got a ground floor and a back with some grids on it to give a sense of depth. You can see that there is this sort of cone-like shape, the red one on the ground, and these cones on the background. They are, of course, all casting shadows from a local light source, which you can see is somewhere around here. And of course, since this is a 3D scene, I can move this thing around and make the appearance of the shadows dramatically different. Now, what we did is we had people view images like what you see here and over here, and then we created composites, fakes, where the shadows in the back and the foreground were inconsistent with a single light source. So for example, I might take the back wall of this image, that's down in here, and I might take the foreground and the red cone from that image and create a composite where now this long shadow and those short shadows are not consistent with a single light source. Okay? So we did what was called a 2 alternative force choice experiment. I show you an image like this or an image like this, 50-50, they're balanced, obviously randomized, and I simply ask you, are the shadows consistent or not? And we have a little precursor. We explain what we mean by cast shadows and so on and so forth. And it's a surprising experiment. Only 20 subjects, but very robust effect. These were undergraduate students at University of Rutgers University, where my collaborator Mary Bravo was at the time and was a collaborator on this project. Average response time was about 5 seconds, so they spent 5 seconds looking at the image, made a determination. I'm going to show you the average results over 20 individuals for images that were in fact the accuracy on determining the difference between a real and a fake image when the light was always on the same side of the room. So, for example, the back wall may have the light here, the front cone may have the light over here. So when the inconsistency was the light was on the same side of the room, overall accuracy was 53.8%. Chance is 50%. It's a 2 alternative force choice experiment. You're guessing, flipping a coin, you're at 50%. They're basically guessing. When, not surprisingly, the light was for the back wall was on this side of the room and the light for the front plane was on this side of the room, well, then they were basically perfect. They were at 95%. So when the light is radically different, coming in from 2 completely different directions, and you can even see this. You got a bright spot on the ground over there. You got a bright spot on the back wall over here. The shadows are moving completely opposite directions. People don't have a problem with that. And we did this essentially as a base case to make sure that they can even do this. If they couldn't do this, something's wrong with the experiment. But when it counted, when the light was basically in the same side of the room, they were a chance. And that's very, very bad. Now, what's interesting about this is why. Like, what are they doing? And what we found when we analyzed the data is that the errors were not, in fact, flipping a coin. They weren't random. There was some sort of method to the madness. And so we posited that there may be 2 cues that our participants were picking up on. One was that they were looking at the relative orientation of the shadows on the back wall, across the back wall and the ground plane, and saying, well, if they're consistent, they should all line up. So they were using image orientation as a proxy for consistency. That'd be a reasonable cue to use. Or maybe they were using the length of the shadow as a proxy. That actually wouldn't make a lot of sense, of course, because tall objects have a long shadow and short objects don't, but we posited that may be what they're doing. And what we found was, in fact, they are using orientation. So on this plot, what I'm showing you is their overall accuracy. Again, chance is 50%, completely wrong is 0, and perfect is 100%. And this is the difference in the orientation between the shadows on the back wall, the average orientation of the shadow on the back wall, and the average orientation here as measured in the image plane, obviously not in the 3D world, which we don't have access to when we're looking at this image. And what you can see is that they're highly correlated. So when the orientation difference is very small, they're actually pretty good, and as that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, they start to fall apart. So in fact, it looks like we're doing is using a very, very simple but completely wrong image cue to infer the correctness of cast shadows. And this despite the fact that you know what the right cue is, because we've done this in a previous lecture. If I connect points on the shadow to corresponding points on the object, assuming that the light is in front of the camera, and draw them out, they will intersect at a single point. And for an inconsistent shadow, that's just wrong. So what's interesting here is that the information is sort of available to participants. Like, if you knew this, you might now do this task a little bit differently, but it's not our intuition. It's not our instinct to look at the image and try to think about this simple geometry. We have this other sort of simplified cue, which we don't necessarily understand where it comes from, but it is just wrong. So in fact, when people look at cast shadows, they're quite poor. Okay, let's look at reflections. It's a similar geometry. So this is one of my favorite examples. This is actually a real image. It was taken during one of the horrible hurricanes that struck Florida. The zoo had put the flamingos into the bathroom. I love this photograph because, well, you know, it's a bunch of flamingos in a bathroom. Who doesn't like that? But also, when I first looked at it, I thought, okay, the flamingos are jammed all the way to the back of that bathroom. Why don't I see any reflections in that back mirror there? I thought that was weird. And then, of course, I thought to myself, oh, I see, it's surface normal angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. So I had to reason my way out of that, and then I understood why. And so we wondered the same thing, which is when we show people simple images with reflections on mirrored surfaces, how would they do? We're going to play the same game. So here what I'm going to do is I have a simple room. I've got a mirror standing in the middle of it. We told participants it was a mirror. I have a single object in the room, and I can move that object. So here it's far from me, here it's close from me, and it may or may not have a reflection in the mirror. So those are all authentic images. And then we created these composites again. So for example, I would render two scenes with the objects in two different places, and then I would take the mirror from one object, from one scene here, and put it into the composite scene. I would take the rest of the scene from another image, another rendering rather, and put it here. And now this is a physically impossible scene with a planar mirror, and the reflection is just wrong. And by the way, you could just look at this. Like if I just showed you this one on the bottom, it doesn't actually look that wrong unless you really start thinking about the underlying geometry. So same game, two alternative forced choice experiment. We showed 20 participants. Scenes, half were real, half were fake, fully randomized. This time they took a little bit longer, 7.5 seconds, so they're a little bit probably less sure. And what we find is that when the scenes had a consistent reflection, their accuracy was 62%, slightly above chance. When the scene had an inconsistent reflection, this is the composite that you saw on the previous slide, they were at 50%, they were just guessing. Okay. And again, what's interesting here, we did not actually find any rhyme or reason to it. We didn't find a heuristic they were using, they just get it wrong. And again, this is despite the fact that the information is sort of there. So, same game. I've got a mirrored surface. I have a bunch of objects out here. If I connect points on the object to corresponding points in the reflection and draw straight lines, they will converge at a vanishing point. And so if I move the shadow in the image to be inconsistent with the geometry here, you get an inconsistency. And so the information is, in fact, available to the human visual system. We just don't reason that way. And of course, that probably shouldn't be that surprising. There's no real reason for us to have evolved the visual system to ask ourselves about the shadows and the reflections that we see, whether they're real or not. They're real. We're looking at the physical world. That tiger's shadow is real. That tiger's reflection in the water is real. Run. That was it. So there's really no good evolutionary reason for this, and that's at least part of an explanation for why we just aren't very good at it. All right, experiment number 3, planar perspective projection. This is going to be about the vanishing points in effect. Okay, so here's the game again. We have a simple scene where we have texture mapped onto a planar surface, an image of an object. So it's a lamp, it's a car, it's a house, it's just some familiar object. On these two planes that are lying down, the whole thing is of course lying on a flat surface, one of those two is correct. When by correct, I mean that if I viewed that plane from up top, it would look like the center plane. And the other one, the image has been skewed this way or this way, and then texture mapped so that when I look at it, it doesn't actually look like this. Okay, now, so participants' task was, please look at the scene. Tell me, right or left, which one of these is the same object as this. And when I say same object, we explain to them, it's not just that it's a lamp, that it appears the same, and we explain to them, we actually had a physical setup where we picked things up and we looked at them and we explained that when you look this way and this way, there's perspective distortion. So they understood the nature of perspective distortion. And so here's what it might look like in reality, which is you have the center lamp here. On the right over there is the correct answer because that lamp looks like the center one. And here you can see the lamp was skewed before being textured mapped. And so, in fact, it does not look like that central one. So here the correct answer would have been this. So 15 subjects, 3-second response rates. They're very, very comfortable with this. Accuracy is here, which is, again, chance is 50%, one or the other. And this on the horizontal axis is how much did we skew the image before we texture mapped it onto one of the little planes. So what you can see is that as the skew gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the accuracy gets better. So when you have this really distorted image on the plane, sure, people are good at it. But at even relatively small, so 50% is right there. So even at some amount of skew, people are not that good at the task. And let me show you what I mean by not that good at the task. So there's an interesting asymmetry here, which I'm not going to get into, but when you can see that the accuracy here depends on the orientation of the plane. And this actually turns out to be a good reason for this, but again, I'm not going to get into it. But let's look at this panel right here. So here, again, chance performance is 50%. Yeah? And so the horizontal axis is how much did I skew. So this image right here was skewed quite a bit. The 0 image was skewed not at all. So when we had this huge amount of skew here, people are only slightly better than chance. So even though there's a really big distortion, people are bad at it. And by the way, what's going on here is that this particular skew on the left plane, because of the perspective projection, tends to undo the skew, and so it looks more normal. This skew on the right plane ends up exaggerating the skew because of the orientation that the plane is moving in, and then people are good. So that's where the asymmetry is coming from. So in fact, people are quite bad at reasoning about the shape of things due to planar perspective projection. Even though, again, just like the shadows, just like the reflections, the information is actually in the image. So here what I'm showing you is a little peek into a lecture we're going to do on 3D modeling. Whereas if I take a picture of that flat license plate, this is essentially what I was asking people to do, is to reason about the information on a planar surface, I can undo that distortion to generate that image. And again, I'll show you this in the 3D modeling segment. And so the information is here. We do have access to it. We just aren't reasoning about it. So again, you see that same pattern over and over again. Shadows, reflections, and perspective projection. That our visual system doesn't seem to really care about these things, or it dismisses them without really reasoning about them properly. And that's sort of the take-home message here, which is be very, very careful when you visually inspect images, particularly around these types of 3D physical properties, because it turns out that this thing is not particularly well trained or evolved to reason about them. So I thought this would be a good chance to do one of my favorite case studies on the Lee Harvey Oswald, because parts of what people argue are reasons why you should believe that this image is fake have to do with some of the things that we saw up top. So let's see what those are. So the first is that the shadows, it is argued, in the image are inconsistent with a single light source. Obviously, this is an outdoor image. So what do they mean by that? Let's see here. This is a magnified view of his face from the image, of course. And look at the shadow of the nose and ask yourself, well, if I just saw that and nothing else, well, what would I think? Where would I think the sun is? I'd probably think it was above me, casting that long shadow down. It seems like a reasonable inference. But now go over to the image and look at the shadow being cast by Oswald's body onto the ground, and it seems like the light is off to the side. So that does seem like a discrepancy. By the way, notice that this is exactly the experiment we did. We have cast shadows onto two different surfaces, this surface on the face and the ground plane, and those surfaces are perpendicular to each other. This, in fact, is what inspired that experiment up top. That's not an accident. All right, that's argument number one. Shadows seem to be, there seems to be two suns there. We think that his head was spliced in from another image. Argument number two, what you see over here is a mugshot of Oswald shortly after being arrested. You see that he has a very narrow, tapered chin, in fact, quite distinct. But in the photo, that doesn't look like his chin. It looks really fat and broad, almost like it's, well, people argue somebody else's chin. So some people argue that the face geometry is not correct here, in particular this chin. Okay, that's number two. Number three, people argue that if you measure that rifle in the image, it is not, as it should be, 1.02 meters, which is the length of the rifle that it purportedly was used to kill President Kennedy and was found in the tower. So that's a sort of a photogrammetric question. And the last is this issue of balance, which is it looks like Oswald is leaning back on this leg and he's holding this heavy gun. And how could he be standing like that? It seems like he should be off balance. I've never really understood the argument, but whatever. All right, I'm going to actually address it even though I don't really understand it. All right, so here's what we did to do the analysis. So notice that in all those arguments, the shadows, the shape of the chin, the length of the rifle, and the balance all have to do with the underlying 3D geometry of his body, the 3D geometry of the gun that he's holding, and the 3D geometry of the sun. All right, well, we know how to think about 3D geometry, so we're going to build a 3D model. So we know how tall and how much Oswald weighed, so we did something that was proportional. We took an articulated 3D model, and we posed him so that when we placed the camera roughly the distance to Oswald with the focal length that we know that camera was, we could pose him so he was in the same pose. Now that pose, this is a 3D model, we could put weight in him. So the little red dots you see there, we distributed weight across Oswald's body proportional to his weight and how much weight we know each segment of the body and a typical adult male gets. So the torso gets this much percent, the thigh gets this much percent, and so on and so forth. So we distributed weight in Oswald, and we're going to do that, of course, in order to check his balance down the road. We got 3D models. You can see I've got a gun on his side, and I've got him holding the rifle. So we now have that weight associated with the gun and the sidearm as well. And then we skinned him and rendered him. And when we skinned and rendered him, we kept moving the light until the shadows on the ground plane, which is what we saw in the original photo, matched the original photo so we can infer where the light was. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you is an outline of my 3D model, that's Oswald in blue, and the shadow in red, and I'm superimposing that atop the original image. And what you can see is they basically line up perfectly. So the gun, his body, and the shadow are all consistent. So we got the 3D geometry of the body right. We got the 3D geometry of the sun right. We know where the sun is. And once we've done that, well, now we can start reasoning about the image. Okay, so what was the first argument is that the shadows, there's no way you have this long shadow on the mouth and from the nose and that shadow on the ground plane. Sorry guys, that's wrong. So that scene rendered with a single light source generated that face, long shadow coming straight down, and the shadow on the ground plane. So in fact, That was just a failure of the visual system to understand the 3D geometry of shadows, and in fact, those two shadows are exactly consistent with a light source. So, argument number one, gone. All right, argument number two. What I didn't tell you is that the 3D model, the body was a generic body that was fit to his height and weight. The head, however, was customized to the mugshot images so that we can capture his geometry and most importantly, his chin. So this is a custom 3D head that you see here. And notice that in our 3D model, the chin is nice and tapered as you would expect from the original photo. Now, let's illuminate him in the scene. What happens? Look what happens to that really thin chin. Look how broad it is now, almost exactly consistent with what you see there. What's happening? It's a shadow. That's all it is. So what's happening is the light is very harsh from above and it's casting a shadow down the sides of the face, and so it's making the chin look fat when in fact all that's happening is you can't see the sides of the face because they're in shadow now. Perfectly reasonable, plausible explanation. The geometry of his face is perfectly consistent with Oswald. We made the measurement of the rifle. It is exactly 1.02 meters long. There's nothing inconsistent with the shape of the gun. And the balance, this was a fun one, even though I've never really understood the argument. So we had, remember, I know his weight at the time he was arrested, and I can distribute that weight across him. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask, is he balanced? Well, what does it mean to be balanced? I compute your center of weight. That's that yellow dot that you see right there. Sorry, your center of mass. So just take a weighted average of all those masses that I put on your body. Your center of mass is here. What does it mean to be balanced? Well, if my center of mass is in the bounding area of my feet, I'm stationary. If I start to lean forward, I fall. Why? Because my center of mass goes outside of what my feet, I can feel my feet lifting right now, and I tip forward. That's all it is. That's all balance means. So when we project that center of mass down onto the ground, you can see that it's well within the bounding area of his feet, and in fact, he is perfectly stable. There's nothing imbalanced. And that little, those circles there are a little error analysis we did to see how vulnerable we were to errors. And it turns out that we could have made huge errors in the weight, in the positioning, and it's extremely stable. There's no reason to think that he could not have been standing like this with the gun and not tipped over. So this was an interesting case study. You saw all kinds of claims about photo manipulation from the shadows, the geometry of the face, the geometry of the gun, and the geometry of the body relative to the balance. All of which are completely unfounded, in my opinion. And we could figure that out by doing this sort of full-blown customized 3D analysis. So, in fact, despite the fact, and I have to admit, this is a reasonable argument, that parts of this photo do not seem to be physically plausible. In fact, I found the shadow argument the most compelling argument. I've had a hard time reasoning about this shadow and that shadow on the ground plane. It didn't make sense to me, but in fact it is. Now, I think that, and I have to say this as an academic and as a scientist, there is another explanation here, which is I may be part of the conspiracy. I'll leave it to you all to figure out whether that's true or not. Okay, so that wraps up this segment, and the take-home message here is that while this thing right here, your visual system, it's actually back here and up here, is remarkable at many, many things, there are certain things it's not particularly good at, and you have to understand that. It is really important because we always, no matter how good our forensic techniques are, we are always going to rely on the human visual system when we're analyzing imagery, and we have to understand what are we good at and what are we not good at, and supplement those things that we are not good at with strong quantitative tools. I would argue, by the way, you need the quantitative tools for the things you're good at too, just to make sure that bias and error don't slip into. But particularly the things having to do with physics and geometry and 3D geometry and lighting, be very, very careful, because not only are we not good at it, we don't actually know that we're not good at it. So one of the things I didn't mention is that in all those experiments that I described early on, when we asked people their confidence, they were actually pretty confident of their answer. So be very, very careful. Okay, so that's it for this segment. What comes next are a bunch of actual forensic techniques for doing analysis in physics-based techniques, and we'll pick it up in a little bit when we come back. Thank you.